What's going on, gamers? This is John with Gamester81.com. I'm here with Joe from Atari2600.com. How you doing, Joe?
John, it's great to see you as always.
Great to have you back. I know last time we talked about video game manuals, and that was an interesting topic of conversation. I'll put a link to that video below, guys, so you guys can certainly check that out if you haven't seen it already. This episode, we're going to talk about what it kind of takes to become a video game dealer. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. This is kind of an episode or a series of videos that I've been thinking about doing for a while now. So I'm kind of excited about getting the information out there. Awesome.
So what is a classic video game dealer?
Well, that's a great question. You know, a classic video game dealer, at least as far as this video goes, would be an individual or a company that is really focused on classic and rare and expensive video games. So I mean that in the sense that, yes, we also could consider selling newer games or just used video games, but in the context of the video, what I'm really kind of trying to strive for is the type of a company that would buy and sell video games in the hundreds, even thousands of dollar price range. And that's acceptable to be the description for a classic video game dealer. And it also should be important to note that this venture is done for profit. We're not collecting video games at this point. We're discussing buying and selling video games for a living to make a profit.
You have to feed the family, right?
Well, and April's coming up, and so, you know, you've got, no, it's an important thing that you have to be profitable at what you do, and there's certain ways of going about it. And I think that the classic video game dealer actually is sort of closer in comparison to maybe other collectible hobbies like comic books or baseball cards, coins and stamps and things like that. That's kind of the model we're looking at here.
So there is a market, you see a market for people who are looking to buy those more expensive, more rare title games.
Certainly there is.
Okay.
And as a commercial venture, it's certainly easier to make, it's better to sell a video game for $100 than it is to sell, 100 video games for $1. And that's kind of the business model that we're trying to focus on here. And yes, there certainly is a strong international demand for better quality, rare, and expensive video games.
So we're going to talk about pricing a little bit later in the video about how you find the right price, because obviously you need to find a market that people are willing to pay, but also there's got to be some type of markup on the video, on the game, correct?
That's true.
So would you recommend selling video games to those listeners who are maybe interested in selling video games perhaps professionally? Would you recommend getting into this?
Again, you know, that's just a great subject to bring up and a great question. And I'll just cut right to it and say, yes, if you have an interest in video games to begin with, selling them professionally is a natural progression from collecting to doing more with it and taking it a step further. And I like the idea and the profession for a couple reasons. You know, one is that it has a nice mix of computer skills, people skills. There is some use of analysis tools and software. Also, there's a physical aspect of it, which means it's not just a mental operation. There you have to stock and pack and ship. So there's a physical component and a mental component, which for me personally, it makes it a very satisfying experience.
Is there ever a situation, I'm curious if there's ever a situation where you come across a game, and I'm assuming, I know you're a big gamer as well, you like collecting games. Is there ever a situation where you find a game and you're like, man, I love this game, I don't necessarily want to sell it? Do you struggle with that ever? Like, think, you know, as a business person, as an owner of a business, you have to kind of, you have to sell it, but then you got a personal emotion into it as well. How do you separate your personal emotion in a business motion into it?
You know, the passion about collecting never really leaves. And I think it's true that, yes, I do have certain items that I have set aside. And as you handle a lot more video games, you really start to realize, man, this is really something that is scarce. I don't mean that I'm holding on to things that are expensive. It means that if you've been handling video games, rare video games, for a decade or more, and when something comes across your table that you haven't seen in 10 years, I do tend to hold on to it. And I have a small personal collection of items that I just know that, you know, and they're not necessarily expensive.
It could be sentimental, right?
They're sentimental, and also things that are just so unusual to find. And in a lot of cases, it could be variations of a common game with a label variation, box variation, things that are just not really appreciated yet as far as how rare they truly are.
So what's the biggest difference between collecting or video games and collectibles? What's the difference between when it comes to selling them? What's the biggest difference?
You know, I bet a lot of people would probably say that, well, video games are a non-traditional type of a collectible. Certainly a collection of coins or even comic books, they go back 50, 70, 100 years. And video games, how could anybody buy and collect video games when it's just something that's a modern type of a technology? But the biggest question that I have, or the biggest difference, I should say, between a more traditional collectible and classic video games is the fact that there is no standard catalog or pricing guide to classic video games. That is in the sense that there isn't a catalog that's issued every year, and video game collectors all refer to that collecting guide when they buy and sell.
Like comics would have.
Like comic books have. I know the CBG Comic Buyer's Guide, and coins use a red book. Everybody that collects coins or comics or stamps, they have those standard references that they can say, I have it's in Scott Catalog, it's $100, and you know what that means. With the classic video games, no such resource exists, and that's a huge difference. It can also be an advantage, which is, I'll kind of get into some of the advantages of not having that. But if you decide that that's something that you'd be interested in doing as a profession, is selling classic video games, at this point in history, you're going to need to develop your own pricing models and your own ability to come up with what actual prices are.
And it seems that prices fluctuate so much in video games, whether they increase in value or maybe decrease in value. But I know, like Digital Age, for example, they have, or Digital Press, they have a pricing guide on their website. But it seems like it's out of date, and it seems like in order to really keep up with it, you'd almost have to update it monthly.
And as a professional classic video game dealer, that's one of the burdens that you're going to have to assume is you have to keep ahead of that. It seems you're absolutely correct. There's a big dynamic in video games. Games peak in interest and then they fall in interest. Demand will come in. There's an overall market trend lifting prices right now, with prices generally escalating, but all games don't increase at the same rate. And if you rely on data that is 6 months old, a year old, or somebody that quoted a price from 2010, you're woefully ill-informed as to what something is actually worth today. It's a challenge and an opportunity.
So what are some mistakes that buyers and sellers make? What are some common mistakes that people make?
The number one thing that I see as a mistake going in is confusing the word rarity with price. And it's a common thing, and a lot of the websites sort of support this type of a notion that, hey, I have a video game here that's in the website, and it's rated as an 8. A rarity 8 out of 10. I have another video game which is in the same guide, which also is a rarity 8, so those games must be similar in price. Or because of the rarity, you could assume that it would be equally as difficult to maybe acquire that video game. And rarity and price are completely different because they miss one element. The element they're missing is demand. So rarity may be like hard to acquire, but if there's fewer people looking for it, then the price would be less than if there was a lot of people seeking it out. The price would tend to be up.
So rarity and demand don't necessarily coincide.
No, absolutely not. Rarity would be how scarce an item is, but in this collectible hobby, demand is absolutely far more important than rarity. Demand is it. If without the demand, your prices are going to tumble. And I can show example of scarce, rare video games that are really very inexpensive because there's really not a market for it. Nobody's seeking them out.
Sure.
So demand is, and rarity, collectors often will say, oh, the rarity, and they're just missing the most important element of price, which is demand. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you have to have people who are interested in the game first, right? It could be a rare game, maybe people don't necessarily don't know about it, and maybe the demand isn't there.
And you could say that could be a buying opportunity. If you're the first person to know something, hey, this box variation really is very hard to find, but the price is kind of low. If you were savvy and wanted to look far enough in the future, if you get in on the ground floor on that and more people realize it, then certainly the price is going to go up, and you just got yourself, you did very well buying that. That's an opportunity for you.
That kind of goes into my next question, is how do you determine what games to purchase for your store?
You know, and if you decide to take a profession and the object of this is to make a profit, boy, you really have to know what you're doing when it comes to pricing. And you touched on it earlier about the volatility in the marketplace. And so I prepared a couple slides today that I wanted to show you, and we can maybe put those up and then discuss them as we're going through them. And what the slides really show, though, is a pricing analysis. Now, this is not something that you'd have to do if you were selling comic books. You'd refer to the guides. Lack of that reference material means you have to take this responsibility on yourself.
Okay.
And there's a lot of information if you decide to dig in and do your own pricing analysis. And I think the first one that I wanted to show you was a super rare and highly popular, meaning in-demand video game for the Nintendo NES system, which is Flintstones Surprise at Dinosaur Peak.
What makes this game so rare and so high in demand?
If you're talking pure rarity now, it was one of the last games released for the system in November of 1993. And also it was exclusive only to Blockbuster video stores. And so it went right into the rental marketplace. So late release, obviously the Nintendo was decreasing in popularity, only into the rental market. It's generally considered to be the second rarest licensed game for the Nintendo NES.
What's the first?
Stadium events.
Stadium events, okay, of course.
So that means that it's a really well-known, rare game for the Nintendo system, and a lot of people would really like to have the game, or even better, the box and game and manual in their collection.
Sure. Well, you get those completists, too, who have to have every single game, right? And those, not that every Nintendo collector needs to have every single game, but you get that small few that do want every single game, and this is usually the last game in their collection they have to
And because it's a licensed game, it really gives it the authority that it should be in your collection. It's not an imported game or an unlicensed game that may or may not be. Some people would tend to exclude those, but because it's a licensed game from Nintendo, if you collect U.S. licensed NES games, which most people do, you need it. It's in there.
Okay.
Now let's take a look at let's look at the slide up here.
Okay.
Okay, this is the pricing guide, or the pricing slide for Flintstones. Now, what you see on the left, the figures that are the column on the left would be prices that the Flintstones Surprise at Dinosaur Peak have sold for on eBay in the last 90 days. You can see that the most expensive one sold for $2,100. And the least expensive during that period was an $800 purchase.
And that was a buy it now price. So perhaps the seller didn't know.
This is a good example of, I think the seller really botched it. The buyer got a great deal. Now, if you're going to be buying this game for your store, let's say you want to, this would be a great game that you'd want to keep in your store because you're going to have an easy buyer. You shouldn't bank on buying that game for $800. Somebody got lucky and bought it for that price. But in reality, look at the numbers above it. You can see that there's a trend here at $1,500 where 3 of the games sold between $1,524 and $1,540.
Okay.
In fact, up to $1,800. And then you can see that, again, a buy it now at $2,100 at the top of the list. Maybe that one's a little bit outside of the market. I think that might be pushing it a little bit because the next one below it was $100 less.
So maybe that's an example of maybe the buyer.
The buyer maybe not being as informed. Now, if you're going to be a professional here, where do you want to buy this game complete in the box? Well, the average price of that game, if you take out the $800 buy it now, the average price is about $1,600.
Okay. I
would say that the first thing you should do with this information is you should decide where do you want to sell it for. I wouldn't recommend selling it for more than $2,000. I think it's going to be a little outside of the marketplace right now. If you'd like to sell it within a month or so, or even less, I would suggest that you might want to price that game in good condition at maybe $1,800 to $1,900.
Okay.
Which is great if you're going to buy that game because look, if you bought it for $1,500, it's a game that's highly popular and in demand. If you were one of the bidders that bought for $1,520 or $1,530, you should reasonably be able to expect that you'll be able to sell that game for maybe $1,800, maybe $1,850.
Just flip it.
Right. Now that's going to give you a $300 profit. That's over 20% return, and you should be able to do that within a month. This isn't a game you're going to have to sit in your inventory for a long time waiting for that to happen.
What's the average percentage of return on a game? What is 20% usually pretty good? Like, what do you?
I mean, from experience, I can say that 20% on a game of this price is great. If you were talking a game that sold for $5, you're not going to get there. 20% on a game that's $1,000 or a $1,500 game, yes, that's a totally reasonable profit. Because if you would like to make 50% profit, you know the problem is you're never going to buy that game. If you expect to buy it for $900, let me tell you, you're going to be waiting a very, very, unless you happen to be there on that one day and were fortunate to buy the one for $800. You can't run a business on assumptions that you couldn't. You have to buy and sell. So narrower profit margin is important.
Do you ever buy in a lot? Do you ever buy a lot of video games and you get lucky and this game comes across, or you know, you get really bad games as well?
Well, this is, we're looking at this game just as one game. But yes, if it was included in a collection, you still need to have this information though, because if this game was included with 10 others, your price for that collection I would assume you'd still be paying somewhere around $1,500 for the Flintstones game. The other games would then be added on to the price of the collection, and you would be able to make a reasonable offer that you could make a profit at.
Okay.
And the same information on the slide is represented to the right. We don't need to get into the details, but the cartridge only, I think it's dynamic to see this, that the cartridge alone in the last 3 months has sold for a high of $950 and a low of $460.
Wow.
It's an enormous range. This is a great opportunity for a person that is a professional to make a profit. This game would, I would say, in the retail price, you should easily expect to sell this game for around $800.
So this person who bought it in December for $349.99, they could flip it in several months and triple their investment.
In that case, you could. It takes diligence, and you have to be in a buying position. But there are several people here that bought at $500, $560, $610. I would say that all those prices would be fine. These were competitive bids made on eBay in the months of December. There was January in here. You should easily be able, because look at the prices that are much higher than that. There's not just a couple examples, but there's a lot of examples. So again, this is a great way to do some data analysis. Now you're informed. You can ignore what you see on other price sites. You know now today that I'm a buyer for that game, and I'm a buyer for that game at $600 in a cartridge, and I'd buy it right now. You don't have to think any further than that. You're an informed buyer, you're an informed seller, and now you're in a position to make a good profit.
And that's what the demand is driving the price to be.
I'd say the demand's driving this price up. I mean, when you see at the top of this cartridge list, 3 of these games that are selling for, well, this is $898, but 3 of these games have sold for $900, cartridge only, and buy it now and competitive. See, competitive bids, a good way to think about that, John, is that's real money on the table. That's not a buyer that makes a mistake and overpays with a buy it now, or maybe gets a great deal on a low price buy it now. Competitive bids mean there's 2 people in the marketplace bidding head to head for that. That's real money on the table, which tells me that if there's a competitive bids at $800 and $900 here, hey, I mean, maybe this price on this cartridge seems to be going up, 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 and I would not be surprised within the next 6 months to see it over $1,000 for just the cartridge alone. Now, let's segue into the next game that I've profiled here today, which is Atari 2600 game Chase the Chuck Wagon, which I profiled it because it's sort of a marquee title for the system. A lot of collectors that collect Atari games are really interested in it. And if you put that slide up, you can see right away there's something that jumps out at me right away. Remember the Flintstones game? The cartridges we saw, was it 15 games have sold on eBay in the last... Look at this. Now this chart here for Chuck Wagon goes back 1 year. Not 3 months, 1 year. So immediately what we know, and because we did the analysis, is Chase the Chuck Wagon for the Atari 2600 is magnitudes rarer than Flintstones. If 15 Flintstones cartridges are selling in 3 months and only 5 Chuck Wagon cartridges are selling in a year, you can tell that it's a much rarer video game. But then what's interesting is, look at the prices that it brings.
So the demand isn't necessarily there as much as the
Dinosaur Peak is an exception. I used it because it highlights what demand really does for prices. See, that Dinosaur, Surprise at Dinosaur Peak, is not a rare game. I mean, it is. The prices are unbelievable because the demand is off the hook for it. Now look at the Chuck Wagon, which has traditionally been a rare game, and you can see that the prices are much more subdued.
This game was only available through Purina through a mail-away offer, right? They had a mail-away...
It is, and that really increases the demand for it. Because it's notoriety, it was only a mail-order type of a product, so certainly it wasn't available at retail, and it's much harder to find today. I just wanted to focus real quickly here on the 2 sides of the chart. On the left-hand side, again, we have complete in the box. On the Flintstones, I believe there was 7 of them that had sold in the last 3 months. Here, going back a year, no copies of Chase the Chuck Wagon have sold on eBay in 12 months. One of them was advertised at $649, but it didn't find a bidder at that price.
So as a seller, and so you have a copy of this game unopened or just in box, complete, and you see that it didn't sell for, so you know that the demand, so pricing it at $650 would be kind of silly. I mean, essentially, right?
I would say that historically it hadn't sold for that. Now, we maintain a price guide at Atari2600.com, which uses the same information. But instead of going back a year, ours goes back to 2005. And so we, in fact, have 8 years of data. If you go back 8 years and bring those numbers forward, we're projecting a price on that game at $549, let's just say $550. That's the current price guide on it. And so I think it illustrates a good example. The seller tried to bring $650, and the market resisted. It wasn't ready for $650. And maybe the condition was not perfect, but anyway, certainly there wasn't a buyer. Now on the cartridge side, here you have an example of the cartridge averaging out at 74.25 is the average price right now.
A lot of buy it now.
It's really dominated by buy it now auctions, and you can see
$200. I got overpaid maybe for that.
That was last August, and all you can assume is that it was because there hadn't been one that had sold previous to that, except for in March. So you noticed on the pricing data that there was 2 sales in March, and then there was a gap between March and August of 5 months. It puts the buyer at a disadvantage because maybe they didn't have the pricing information and they didn't have a way to see what it's been selling for most recently. And you know what they did? They made a mistake. They really, really overpaid for that game because you can see that it sold for much less than that. Now, we have a price guide on that one at $69.60, which again is a historical price going back for 8 years. And you can see that it really kind of matches up with the average of here at 74. You know what that tells me is that the price on Chuckwagon is sort of stagnant. If it's if the price guide value is $69.60, let's say 70, and the last year's worth of pricing data shows that it's averaging out at 75, we're not seeing the market that we did with the Flintstones game with the NES, where we see that large increase. Anyway, for your store, for your if you're going to sell video games for a professional, this level of information is invaluable to you. Now you have the information to make a wise purchase decision if it's the right price for you to put that game in your store.
Wow, that's interesting. So you do this for every game
when it comes to rare games like Chuckwagon, it's the slides that I presented here have illustrations, and of course there's no need to do that for just the pricing analysis. But the answer to your question, yes. Yes. When it comes to a game like Chuckwagon, you really need to be informed of what the prices are in the marketplace, and here's how you do it.
What other advice do you give to those listeners and followers who maybe are interested in getting more into selling video games professionally?
Advice would be to start with understanding the market for the rare games. Once you have, like we just went over the pricing information, once you have the, how can I say, experience and ability to do your own pricing models, the less expensive games will come easier. If you tackle the tiger by going after the most expensive games and really analyzing what those games sell for, when collections come through and opportunities come through that include those level of games and much more common, less expensive games, you'll be ready to make that decision quickly because you're not held back by indecision on spending the money for the rare stuff.
I'm just curious if you have either of these games in your for sale right now currently.
Yeah, you know, Chuckwagon, the Chuckwagon we do have complete in the box right now. It's in the inventory. You know what it's priced at?
Guessing $549?
It should be, but you know what? It's so rare that it was only offered one time last year, and the one that we have is really in exceptional condition. Might even be just barely used. It's priced at $650. Now, I know it's funny, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. You're right. It's probably okay. So it's $650, but the condition is great, and it's a super rare game, and it hasn't really been available in the marketplace. I think at $550, that game's a little bit soft. I'm kind of surprised when I did the pricing analysis that it hadn't sold for $650 because I have seen it sell for that. Anyway, maybe the price needs to come down a little bit. In fact, hey, if you're interested in taking it home with you, let's make a deal today, right?
Nice.
So that's how you do it.
Okay. Well, great, Joe. I really appreciate your time today, and please check out Atari2600.com for Chase the Chuckwagon or other classic games. You carry games up to the NES kind of era, right?
Currently we do, although there's plans to move that forward into some current newer generation systems, for example, Super Nintendo and probably the Sega Master System in the near future.
Right on. That's okay. Right, Joe. Well, appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
We'll take care.
Talk to you soon.